Oh, what's this? It couldn't possibly be a modern aircraft appearing on your channel now, could it, Matt? Well, yes, I suppose if you consider an aircraft which entered service back in the 1980s and then left frontline service about 10 years ago, then yes, this is a modern aircraft. It's certainly more modern than some of the models that I like to feature. The Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk was a twin-engined stealth attack aircraft operated by the United States Air Force. It saw service in a variety of conflicts, providing that first strike capability to try and take out the enemy's air defences. As of 2008, however, they've been withdrawn from frontline service and some are still used in a training role. But that's enough of that. I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me in this video as I build and review the 1/72 scale plastic model kit of the F-117 Nighthawk from Revell. For a more detailed view at the content of the kits, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I made on that topic. I'll put a list of products that I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things that you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this kit for yourself. As a reminder though, this kit does require the use of sharp tools, toxic paints and chemicals, and as a result Revell recommends this kit to those aged 10 years and older. As usual, I used my snips to carefully cut the parts away from the sprue and then sanded any rough areas using a sanding stick. There were a few little bits of flash or extra runners in a few places, so I carefully removed these using a sharp knife. The first thing I did on this kit was to mask that canopy component using some tape, which I carefully cut to the right shapes. This was a little bit fiddly and time consuming, but it wasn't too hard to do. Once that was done, I used some clear fix from Humbrol on the inside of the cockpit area. This glue will dry clear and should hold that clear part in place, which was carefully pushed into place on its mounting holes from inside. I used some Humbrol decal fix to get the decal that goes on the inside of the control panel into place. This should help soften it and stick it down onto the plastic. After this, I used some Vallejo camouflage olive green to paint the pilot's flight suit. Tamiya XF15 flat flesh acrylic was used on his little bit of face that was sticking out from under his helmet. I then moved on to use Tamiya XF19 Sky Grey on said helmet. When those paint layers were dry, some Vallejo pale grey wash was applied to the entire figure to bring out some of those recessed details. Tamiya extra thin cement was then used to carefully glue the figure into place in the cockpit. There is a bit of a lug which sticks out from the back of the pilot, and this goes through the pilot's chair. A small circular retaining piece is then glued into the back of the chair. This kit is kind of designed to be built without glue, but I'm gonna use some glue just to make sure everything stays put. When that was done, the cockpit assembly can be glued into place inside the top part of the fuselage. Next, the bomb bay and landing gear sort of component can be glued into the bottom of the fuselage. There are little lugs which it sort of snaps into, and then I ran a little bit of the extra thin cement around the edges just to make sure it wouldn't go anywhere. The wings come in two parts, an upper and a lower component. These can be sort of snapped together and then a bit of glue run along the edges just to make sure that they really are bonded together. I repeated this for both wings on the aircraft, and then when that was completed they could be snapped into place onto the lower fuselage component. I am forever forgetting to put nose weight inside my aircraft with tricycle landing gear. So in an attempt to prevent this and actually probably increase the value of the kit, I stuck in a couple of old pennies which I had lying around. I positioned them where I thought they wouldn't foul the other parts of the model, and then used a bit of super glue just to make sure that they stayed in place and wouldn't rattle around inside the model when it was finished. With that done, I could then add the top fuselage part which we've already prepared from earlier. It just snapped into place and then a bit more glue was used. Then to kind of finish off this bit of the assembly, the tail component can be snapped into place and glued as well. The bombs come in two parts, and that's fairly simple just to join them together. And now we can get on to some painting. I'm going to use this very cheap grey primer to get an overall base layer onto the model. Seeing as the model is moulded in black plastic and the paint scheme at the end is going to be black, you don't really have to paint this if you don't want to, but I thought that the plastic was quite smooth, and giving it a paint finish, a base coat and then some more painting a minute, would give a better look to the model. And speaking of more paint, I'm going to use this Hobbycraft white acrylic spray paint to do all of the internal components of the model, including the landing gear legs and bomb bays. To return the model back to its black paint finish, I'm going to use this cheap can of black spray paint. It's not the best paint in the world, it comes out a little bit blotchy, but after a few thin coats you can get a fairly even finish. You'll notice that on the bottom of the model I've used some foam and masking tape to protect those bomb bays and landing gear bays from this black paint. Finally, after a little bit of time and patience, the paint was now applied, and when it was dry, that masking tape on the bottom of the model and foam could be removed, and it's done an alright job with only a few little bits needing touching up here and there. That camouflage green from Vallejo, which I used earlier, makes a reappearance here. I mixed it up with some X28 acrylic thinner from Tamiya just to make sure that it would flow a little bit better and not be so thick. Thinning your paints will help avoid leaving brush strokes, but you probably will need a couple of thin layers. I used this paint on the bombs, and after a couple of layers they actually look quite good. I'll install them into the model a little bit later. Now though, it's time to get started on those decals. I cut the sheet into more manageable pieces and then soaked them in warm water to release them from the backing paper. During this build now, I'm going to use Microset and Microsol as my setting solutions. First up, I'll use the Microset in the blue bottle. Some of this Microset was applied to the model in the place where the decal was going to go, and then when it had been released from the backing paper due to the water, it was slid carefully into place and then put into its final position. The transfers in this kit were alright. They seemed a little bit thicker than Revell's normal transfers, but on the whole they went onto the model fairly well. I was a little bit surprised by how many there were, seeing as it's quite a simple kit, and how small some of them were, which made them quite fiddly at times. But after some perseverance, they were all in place on the model. Now that they've settled down into the plastic, some of the Microsol in the red bottle was applied onto the top of the transfers just to make sure that they would really melt into the detail on the plastic. This two-step setting solution system's quite good because it really ensures that they are stuck onto the model and aren't going to move, and it kind of helps them look as though they're painted on and not just stickers. Humbrol Satin 165 medium sea grey enamel paint was then thinned down with some white spirit to make a nice thin wash. This wash was applied to the various recessed details and other areas of the model to help bring those details out. When I was happy with the wash being applied, some white spirit on a cotton bud was then used to carefully remove the excess and leave it in those recessed areas. Vallejo aluminium acrylic paint was then used to very carefully paint some of the details on the landing gear legs. I used a very fine brush to do this to make sure I didn't get it in the wrong places. When that was done, some Humbrol Precision Poly with the applicator needle was used to very carefully place some glue so that the landing gear doors could be glued onto the legs of the landing gear. There are some gear bay doors as well that need to go onto the bottom of the fuselage. Once this was done, the landing gear legs could then be glued into their holes. I repeated these steps for the nose gear as well. This was then followed by the installation of the front bomb bay door, and then the actual trestles which hold the bombs inside of the bomb bay. They come in two parts and these were glued together. Once done, you should have two of these. These can then be glued into their holes inside of the bomb bay. The doors that go in the centre of the bomb bay need gluing together. They go back to back and have little mounting holes to let you do this properly. They then get glued into the slots in the centre of the bomb bay. Once that was done, it was time to add the bombs. One bomb goes on each of the trestles, and a little bit of cement was used to hold them in place. Now I'm going to use some of this Vallejo matte varnish, which I thinned down with a little bit of water and put it through my airbrush. This should help to protect all those transfers that we've recently applied and dull down that slightly shiny black finish. Next, I'm going to use some gunmetal grey and this sort of brown uniform colour, which I mixed together with a little bit of X28 Tamiya acrylic thinners. This is going to create a sort of rusty paint colour, which I'm going to apply to the exhaust areas on the back of the model. I wasn't completely 100% happy with that, so I throw a little bit of the olive brown into the mix. I thinned this one down quite a bit so that it would sort of show the other paints through underneath, but again wasn't quite happy, so I added a bit of black wash and then repeated the process. This was pretty much a trial and error kind of deal, but I think it looks okay in the end. Next up, I used this red paint to pick out the beacon on top and bottom of the model, and then some Vallejo black was used to carefully paint the tyres on the wheels, as well as using it to dry brush on those previously painted exhaust areas so that it gave it a slightly more weathered look. The landing gear was then glued onto the landing gear legs, and finally the masking tape removed from the glass. And that is it. This model is now complete. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, on the whole, it's not been a particularly stressful build. In fact, you're able to make quite quick progress given how easy it is to assemble. Back when this kit was first designed, it was intended to be one of those snap-tight sort of easy build kits, and that's quite evident in the way that everything sort of clips together. It sort of implies that you don't need to use glue, but there are some parts that I found that really do need it. So, just to be safe, it's best to use some. Being moulded in black plastic as well means that if you don't want to paint it, you don't have to. Naturally, you've got those white areas and the green bombs, which you kind of probably do want to paint, but other than that, if you wanted to leave it in its black plastic finish and just stick on your transfers, then you completely could. The particular boxing I've got here dates from 2018, so it's not that old, and it's quite evident, I feel, in the sense that the transfers were quite good and the instructions were printed in colour. However, the tooling from this actually dates from 1991, and as a result, I'd say that the detail isn't as good as it could be, and there were a few little bits of flash in different places. Speaking of the decals though, they were well printed, and I did find them a little bit thick. However, I've noticed a little bit of silvering on quite a few of them, which could be my fault, as I didn't apply a gloss varnish as I usually do to the model before putting on these transfers, and the sort of matte black paint that they went straight on top of, I thought it was quite smooth, but I guess it wasn't smooth enough. As far as I can tell, the bomb bay and landing gear doesn't actually have the option to be displayed in a raised configuration either, which is a little bit annoying. So if you did want to have the aircraft in flight, then you would probably have to do some considerable alteration to the model. Also, on the bottom left of the fuselage, there is a moulded copyright date, which you can just see in the pictures. I didn't bother sanding this off just to make a point that it's still there. But I don't understand why Revell decided to do this. It'd be much better to put a copyright stamp on the inside of the model. But anyways, how much could you expect to spend on this model today? Well, doing a quick search online, it seems that around the £20 mark here in the UK is sort of the general asking price for this particular model. However, I'm not sure it's worth that given the very simple nature of the model. And also, as mentioned earlier, this model was tooled back in the 90s as a simple snap-tight kit, which saw releases as part of the Revell and Monogram ranges, but now it's sort of just a normal model kit in the Revell range, and without doing any previous research, you wouldn't really be able to tell that it was one of these simple kits. So for the unsuspecting buyer, they could think they were getting a really highly detailed model and actually end up with something less complicated than they thought. So for me personally, I don't think that this kit is worth the £20. Perhaps if you could get it for half that, then yes, that might be a better decision. But I think it might be time to wrap this review up here. This is a rather simple kit which you can make very quick progress on constructing. This would be perfect for a beginner or someone who just wants to build something quite quickly and doesn't have to worry too much about painting it. Personally, I'm not really sure it's worth the amount of money that they're asking for it at the moment, and without considerable modification you couldn't display this in a flying pose, so what you see is pretty much what you get. But on the whole, it was a fairly fun build to do, and perfect for someone who just wants to do something for a bit of mojo. What did you think of this review? Did you think it was quite fair? And did you enjoy it? Let me know down in the comments. If you're new here and you'd like to see more videos like this, please make sure you subscribe. This video was actually chosen by you, the community, in a recent poll. So to be in with the opportunity to help guide the channel on future releases, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Additionally, this video has taken probably about 6 hours to edit, and that's just the editing. Not to mention all the other things that go alongside building models. This is quite a time-consuming endeavour. So if you think my time was well spent, please drop a like. I'd very much appreciate it. As always, quick shout out to my patrons and channel members for the extra support they give the channel. Special mention to Crazy Loca and Stevie Boy 1971 for their new memberships on YouTube. Welcome to the club. Finally, I think the last thing to do now is say a massive thank you to you for watching this video, and I will see you on the workbench again next time.